Hi, my name is Sam Larko, and this is 5 Stages of SharePoint Grief, coming to terms with the rebuilt workflow platform in SharePoint 2013. This is a re-recording from my October 2013 presentation at the San Antonio SharePoint User Group. I am a software engineer with AIS, and you can reach out to me any number of ways, whether it's through Twitter, my personal blog, or AIS blog. I'm also a contributing author on Microsoft SharePoint 2013 Inside Out. These slides are also up on my blog, and there is a link to a reference post on our AIS blog to this article about converting from a 2010 workflow to a 2013 workflow. So let's go over a little of the agenda here. We're going to lightly touch on how workflow was in 2010. We'll introduce the changes of 2013, dive a little deeper into admin and configuration for 2013, and then look at some development and demo changes that you'll see in the environment. And finally, we'll finish up with the important resources. 2010 workflow. So we all remember that it was all built into the SharePoint install. It's all built inside of SharePoint, and all you really interacted with was that top layer of this diagram here, that orange section. Everything else was abstracted away through there. All the workflows ran under SharePoint, that context and processes. SharePoint Designer did introduce a lot more functionality, including designing in Visio and additional actions, and you could create custom actions as well through Visual Studio, making it far more extensible for your designer workflow developers. And of course, Visual Studio finally got first-person development support for SharePoint that made life much easier with all the new templates you had there. Now, as far as the changes in 2013, the architecture has completely changed. It's no longer hosted inside of SharePoint. You do see a lot more, it's all declarative development at this point. You're not going to be writing a lot of code anymore like you used to with 2010. SharePoint Designer, among other things, now has looping functionality. This is all, from what I believe, and I think the community in general believes, is Microsoft's move to their devices and services reorg that they did a couple months back. This is all kind of what is assumed to be a push towards Office 365 as what they want people to start investing in, as opposed to on-prem. That's just what people are thinking in the community, though. This has not saying that on-prem is going to go away. So, part of the new architecture, we now have a new service called Workflow Manager. This is installed separately from SharePoint. It can be hosted on a SharePoint box if you so choose. That's not necessarily where it needs to be. But if you have a small farm, or you're just working with a dev environment, as you'll see moving forward, that's an option. It's a farm environment, so you can scale out or up as needed. And like I said, it's not SharePoint specific. You're going to be able to run any other workflows that you're maybe using with WPF or any other .NET workflows that you might have running in other parts of your environment through this one farm. It does interact with SharePoint via the web services, so you'll see that it all returns the REST API back into SharePoint and uses OAuth to authenticate between the workflow farm and the SharePoint farm. This is great for SharePoint in the sense that now you don't have to worry about the additional load that workflow might add to your SharePoint farm, and you can offload all that into a whole different farm. Installation configuration. So we have, like I said, you can run it on the same box as your SharePoint environment. Really good for dev, like I'll be using in our demos. Also, if you have a really small farm, you're not doing a lot of workflow, it's not really necessary to spin up more instances. If you have a larger environment, both from a SharePoint perspective and a workflow perspective, you might want to consider building out a workflow farm. There is PowerShell required to associate workflow with SharePoint. As you can see on the right here, the register SP workflow service commandlet is what you need to run once workflow is installed, SharePoint's installed, and you want to link the two together. A couple of things to note about this. SP site, just by looking at this, you would think that means you would need to register the workflow service with each site collection, and that's not the case. This actually registers it for the entire farm, at least in a single, in a non-tenant environment, multi-tenant environment. I would assume that under a multi-tenancy that this is going to that is not accurate. So this is probably per tenant as opposed to per farm technically. But as far as our demos today, I'm running a single tenant farm. Also, as you'll notice, the allow OAuth HTTP, that is basically saying that workflow runs under the assumption of an SSL by default. If you need to allow for non-SSL communications between the farms, you'll need to add this parameter into the call. This is how I've set up my dev environment. Obviously, I'm not dropping however many dollars a year on an SSL for a dev environment. SharePoint Designer. We're going to start with SharePoint Designer first, and before we get into the deep dive Visual Studio here. Like I mentioned, we do have loops in SharePoint Designer, which now you don't have to worry about doing the two workflows to basically trigger each other to create a loop. That we used to have to do. That's something we used to have to do in 2010. If you haven't had that experience. Now you have looping out of the box and available to you. Web service interactions. Web services are, from a SharePoint Designer perspective, is great. Say you have an enterprise that has already built out a large platform based on web services that you want to bring in other data, whether it's SharePoint related data or not. You can now pull that data in even if it hasn't already been surfaced through SharePoint, like BCS or something. This way, you need to pull in your, say, Salesforce data. You can now query that database through any web services you might have available to you through SharePoint Designer Workflow. We also introduced the new idea of dictionaries. Dictionaries are an object that is an array of objects, typically string value or key value pairs. These are, I've only used them so far for interacting with web service actions, but you can build them, you can count dictionaries, you can get items. This is how you would request information to the web service or get the response data from the service. And we'll show you a little bit about that here in a couple minutes. Finally, we have the AppStep. AppStep is essentially running with elevated privileges for SharePoint Designer workflows. There's quite a few gotchas to this, and the setup process is not very simple. I have a link at the end of the session that will explain how to set it all up so you can do AppStep, get AppStep available to you. It's not something that's ready to go out of the box. We're going to go ahead and dig into our SharePoint Designer demo now, and to kind of hit the topic here. All this is going to do is show how to configure a workflow to post data against a list using the SharePoint REST API. This is something I did not see much on, and that there's just not a lot of documentation on how to write data to a list via the web service calls. So that's the real only focus of this demo. Alright, now we're in SharePoint Designer. I've already created the workflow and built out all the actions, but we're going to walk through each of them and show you what's going on here. So, like I mentioned, what this workflow is going to do is just simply post an item to another list whenever an announcement is created. So we have an announcement list which this workflow is associated with, and you'll notice right here that this action right here is what will end up doing the post. So a couple of things to note about interacting with SharePoint's web services. You have to get the form digest value from the site, and all that really does is it gives you a security token. This authenticates your request to make sure that you are supposed to be making the post. So these first two actions just deal with that. We create a dictionary object called context headers, and in it we pass an accept, a content type, and a content length. The accept and content type are of application JSON OData equals verbose. The reason this is used is SharePoint's using OData 3, which has different levels of verbosity, and I've tried using other levels of it, and all I get is a 406, not acceptable. So you have to use OData equals verbose to get a valid response. Then we call our web service. Our web service is at internet.wingtip.com/AP_API/context info. This context info returns the get context web information object, and specifically we're looking inside that object for the form digest value, which I'll show you in a minute. It actually has to be a post method. It is not a get. You cannot do a get against this service. Now you're wondering where our context headers is. You can see that that's obviously not in this so far. It's actually hidden in the properties of the action right here under request headers. This is one of the many gotchas when it comes to working with these web service calls, specifically around SharePoint web services. Finally, I had set the context response so we can get this JSON response data back, and we'll interact with that here momentarily. Next, we have our AppStep. The AppStep, like I mentioned, is elevated permissions. It grants the user full read-write of all sites items. It must include all of the used variables and actions. So if you were to leave one of these other dictionaries out, it will fail. That being said, we actually get the digest value from one, but because we create this variable inside the AppStep, that's fine. So we have to create 3 dictionary objects for this next service call, and this call is actually going to post the item to our list called custom. First, we have our metadata variable. This dictionary just has to have a setting with type, and the value in our case is sp.data.customListItem. So sp.data.customList is actually the entity type name property of the list. If you look in, say, SharePoint Manager you would see when you select a list that each list has this entity type name. However, since we're interacting with list items, the value is actually sp.data.custom list item. So the only piece that changes from list to list, or list item to list item, would be this part here, which is the actual name of the list. Make sure that when you're working with lists, if you use spaces when you create it, you're going to get that ugly underscore 0x0020 underscore XML notation for the space, or the encoded value. And we'll see a little bit about that in the Visual Studio example. Like I said, that's the only property we need to set for the metadata variable. Then we have our post content. Now this includes our metadata dictionary, and it needs to be of type dictionary. And then we also have set a title. This will actually set the list item title, and all I used for this was post it from Workflow on announcement and gave it the announcements title. Next, we actually get a value from the context response dictionary. As you can see here, it's basically an XPath-like notation to get this value. So our path to our form digest value is d/get context web information / form digest value, and then all we do is we load that into the digest value variable we've created, and it's just a string. I log this to the workflow history list, and you can see what the digest value looks like from there. And then we build the dictionary for the post headers. And in here we have the accepting content type again, like we did before, and we also have xRequest digest. This is what you set the digest value equal to. This is the, like I said, this is the security token basically authorizing you to make this post. Finally, we call another web service. This one's at our site _API web /lists get by title, and since our title is custom /items, and again this is a post since we're creating a new item to this on this list. We pass it our post content variable, as well as we've set our request header. I also am getting the response status code, so we can log to the history list the status of our call. And then finally we've added the transition to stage in here. This will, since we don't have any other stages, we just end the workflow. If you had multiple stages, you would transition to another one. I'll go ahead and publish this. And we can come back into our announcements list and create a new announcement. We'll call it Workflow Demo. Click into that. Look at the workflow on this list, or on this list item. You'll see that we've already had one completed. We'll come over here and just see if we have data now in the custom list, and we do. Posted from workflow on announcement, workflow demo. Now that we've clicked into this instance of the workflow, you'll see our two history items logged. This is what a digest value looks like. It's a very, very long string, and it has a timestamp on the end, which I believe is the expiration date and time for this token. And then finally we have our response was created, so we obviously know that it succeeded in creating the item on the list. As you can see, it's a very drawn-out process to create list items via SharePoint's REST services. Thereof, of course, you would be able to do this as you used to before, just by adding a new item to a list through those actions. This isn't a likely scenario for you, but it does give you an idea of what it would take should you decide that the REST services is the way you need it to go or want it to go. It does require two calls to make this happen, 2 web service calls. And that concludes our SharePoint Designer demo. Let's go back to the slides. So we've covered administration and configuration. We've covered SharePoint Designer. Now let's talk a little bit about Visual Studio. As I mentioned before, we moved to a declarative workflow model. The idea is that you don't have any more code that you actually run, likely because of Microsoft's big push to the cloud. You're not going to be able to deploy custom code into Office 365, so it makes sense that the workflow design process is now all declarative. What you're going to see is that you're going to be basing it all around web services to do your heavy lifting of any of your custom development and actions and stuff like that. What you will get is your dynamic value object, which is very similar to the dictionary in SharePoint Designer. As I mentioned, we're doing web services. We have the HTTP send activity, which is similar to the call HTTP service in Designer. You do get CSOM integration working, so you can do workflow in SharePoint apps. You can still do workflow in Sandbox solutions. If you didn't know, Sandbox is deprecated, but it's still supported. So you won't see any new real functionality for Sandbox, but it's still there. It's still an option. Big plus, no more correlation tokens. I don't know how many times I had this issue. I haven't done a lot of workflow, but the times I swear I always get a correlation token issue somewhere, and I never understood why I couldn't progress in the workflow properly, and it was always because I had the wrong token assigned to an activity. So that's not a problem anymore. There are additional activities to interact with the workflow manager. So if you need to know like what's been run or what is running in your workflow, you also have that functionality available to you. We're going to go ahead and go into our studio demo now. And this demo has a little bit more of a topic around it. Basically, we have a list that for new hires on our HR site, HR will add the new hire name and their department into the list, and the workflow will create tasks for HR in a new hire tasks list, which you'll see momentarily. Alright, we're in Visual Studio now. I have a workflow that I've already created, and we'll do like we did with the SharePoint Designer workflow and just kind of step through what I've done here, just to kind of save time. So I have the main sequence, which I've renamed to root, and I've dropped 3 more sequences in here. Much like with the SharePoint Designer workflow, we still have to get context info, so we have a sequence for that. We're going to get information from the current item first, and then we'll finally write the tasks to the new hires task list. But we'll go ahead and look at the get current item. So some of our new activities we have are lookup SP list item. In this, we have the ability to say I want to look at the current item and in the current list. In the preview build of SharePoint 2013, we didn't have that functionality. You had to manually enter the item ID and list ID for some reason. this is changed, so now you have this option, as well as you could look up from other lists. And then we put this into a new dynamic value variable called create our current list item. We go and get the dynamic value properties from this dynamic value, and in this you'll see we want to get the last name, the first name, and the department of the list item, and it's assigned to aptly named last name, first name, department. How I created these was I changed the entity type from type list item to list item of new hires, and what this does is it gives you smart path notation, so you can select last name, first name, department from here. Also, once I set those paths, I had left assigned to blank and just hit populate variables, and all that does is it created variable names for me. One of the catches with that is it had created those variable names and set the scope to get current list item. Now that we needed to put it into root because we needed to use this in some of the other sequences and not just in get current item. Finally, I write the last name, first name, and department to the history list, just because the write to history list is nice to have. This way we can track to make sure we really did get the data in case we had any errors go wrong, anything happened during that process. In get context info, I get the web URI, I load it into a string variable called web URI. So I set that to have a scope of root as well, since we'll use this both for the get context info and for the write task web service calls. As you can see, we have our HTTP send web service call here. I set the URI to web URI plus the context info. It's a post, and we have our context response content dynamic value variable set here that we had created. And then the request headers, you can actually set those through the properties window. And one nice thing about this is it also has a smart lookup for it. So if you need to set other headers as well, you have that ability. Now we're going to get the dynamic value properties from our response, our context response. And just like with the SharePoint Designer one, we need to get the d/get context web information /form digest value, and we're going to throw it into our digest value string object, which is also scoped to root. One thing I didn't show you about this, you may have noticed, I created a variable here, as you can see, ACCCTVal, and I gave it a default value. But basically I'm using this as a constant, just an easy way so I didn't have to retype application/JSON OData equals verbose numerous times. So it's used here. Since it's scoped to root, it's also being used in the other web service call. And finally, I'm writing to history, and I'm just writing the digest value to the history. Next, we're going to write the task. So we need to build dynamic values. Much like we did with the SharePoint Designer, we need to build the metadata and the post request. Like we said, it's going to have a type, and since I have a really poorly named list, you'll see we have this XML escaping or encoding of the spaces. So it is sp.data.new space hire space task list item. And then in our post request, we fill in we add metadata, title, and I've added due date and body as well too. And the body is obviously set to the department variable. In our HTTP send, we are setting it to /API _API web list get by title new hire tasks. I put the %20s in there. It's supposed to work fine with just a regular space. I had some oddities with that before where it sometimes worked and didn't, so I just URL encoded it, and it's been working fine. Again, we've set the response or the request headers with the accept and content type, gave it the X request digest value as well. And then I'm also creating a response code variable, which is of HTTP status code. This is going to be used like we did in Designer demo to just write to the history list saying what the outcome of the call was. So that is the workflow all designed out. Let's go ahead to IE and see how it runs. Alright, so we're in IE, and you can see we have our list here called new hires. We're going to go ahead and just add a new item, and we'll go ahead and add myself in. Obviously I'm going to be an IT, not HR, and we'll go ahead and save that. And the workflow is kicking off in the background at this point. We'll go ahead and start that up, but we should be able to come in here to our new hires task list and refresh this. And we actually see two. So I have another workflow that's been running as well that I haven't cleared off of this list yet. But we set up the orientation date for Sam Larko Sam. I believe this is the current one. And yeah, so for Larko Sam, description's IT, due date of 10/31. If we come back over here, we'll see that well, we had both of our workflows run here. This was the one we were just looking at. It's essentially the same workflow. There's one minor difference in what's written to the new list item. Well, like we see, here's our write to history that's at the end of get current item. Here's our digest value from the context info sequence, and this is our response code, which is created. And that seems a little easier, or at least a little more expected when it comes to Visual Studio as opposed to SharePoint Designer. But it is a bit of a difference to get used to, not having to write any code. It'll probably grow on you over time, but if you've been writing a lot of workflow, you've probably been doing a lot of code with it. So yeah, you got a bit of a learning curve in it, but it shouldn't be too bad. Let's go back and finish up our slide deck. Alright, so we're down to just our resources here, and this will be the last slide. So if you're not using Pluralsight, you really should. Pluralsight is a great place to learn just about anything when it comes to development, especially. But they're growing their library as far as IT pro type videos. But Andrew Connell's Pluralsight video on Intro to SharePoint Workflow was a huge help in getting me started on developing this presentation. Fabian William, he has a great post on SharePoint Designer and Fiddler. This is how I figured out the demo for SharePoint Designer. He is the only blog post, or the only information on the web for interacting with SharePoint's web services, especially through SharePoint Designer. It is a must-have when talking about what we just did today. I did do a workflow install and config video back for SharePoint Saturday San Antonio last October, so that'd be October of 2012. That is up on YouTube, and feel free to take a look at that if you want to know a little bit about that for those IT pros who might be looking for something more up their alley from this presentation. Finally, the post I had told you about getting AppSteps to work and running workflows with elevated permissions. This is a absolute must read if you need that functionality. This makes it very easy to understand on how to go through and get it configured. It is a non-trivial configuration process, but at least it explains it very well. It's very easy to walk through. That concludes this presentation on Workflow 2013. Thank you for watching.